Hey, I'm Hunter from SkillThrive, and in this video, we're going to create 3 modern CSS hover effects. To get started, we're going to be writing our code in codesandbox.io. So if you don't already have an account, go ahead and sign up and create a free account. And once you have that and you're logged in, go ahead and click on Create Sandbox. Now, under Official Templates, you should see this static, but if you don't, you can always come up here and then filter templates and then search for static here. Go ahead and click here to create a new static project. All right, and now that we have this, the first thing we want to do is just go ahead and get rid of this H1 here. I'm going to zoom in so it's a little easier for you to see the code. Go ahead and make this a little smaller. All right, so the next thing we want to do is just go ahead and change this title to something like 3 modern CSS hover effects. And then what we want to do is we want to pull in the font that we're going to be using in this project, which is going to be coming from Google. So we'll head to fonts.google.com. We'll search for the font that we're using in this video, which is Poppins. Go ahead and select it. Come down and select the regular 400. Then you want to copy this link tag. Come in and then paste it right below the title. Then let's go ahead and save that. And now we should have Google, this Poppins font loaded, and we can use it in our CSS. Below this, we need to go ahead and import our CSS. Now, out of the box, Code Sandbox and even VS Code come with this tool called Emmet pre-installed, which allows you to write HTML really quickly. So what we can do is we can say link, and then we can just use our arrow down to CSS, and then click on enter. And now we have our style sheet imported. Now, right now, we don't have this style sheet created, so let's go ahead, come over here, click on this icon to create a new file and call this style.css. Okay, so that's everything for the HTML as far as the head of the HTML. Now what we want to do is go ahead and write all the HTML here in this body tag. Now again, I want to be using Emmet here to write the HTML really quickly, but if you're not comfortable with Emmet yet, just go ahead and copy the HTML that's generated from Emmet. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a div. This div is going to have a class called container. And here we're going to have another div called buttons. And then in this div, we're going to have our buttons. And that's going to be a link tag, which we're going to style to look like a button. Then we're going to have an href on this, on each link tag. And it's just going to, for now, just be an empty pound sign. Then we can go ahead and add some classes onto the button. So that's going to be button. And then we're going to increment button 1, 2, and 3. And a quick way to do that with Emmet is to say button, dash, and then a $sign. And Emmet knows to start at 1 and then go up to how many elements you actually have. Then inside this button, we can go ahead and add some text for each of these. And then to get 3 of these, we can just say multiply times 3. And then once we hit return or enter, we now have that div class with container. Then another one inside of it called buttons, and then we have our 3 buttons here. So let's go ahead and save that. And now we can see we have all the HTML that we need in order to move forward into styling. So let's go ahead and jump into our style.css. At the top here, I like to go ahead and set some resets. So we're going to target everything here with an asterisk, and then anything below we can reset in our styles below. So let's do box sizing. Will be set to border box. We'll go ahead and reset the padding for all the elements, and we'll go ahead and do the margin as well. And this is going to just reset any of the default values that come out of the box with the browser that we're using, or in this case, Chrome. Next up, we want to go ahead and give our HTML and our body elements a height of 100. And this isn't necessary. We're just using this in order to center the buttons on the page. So this might not be necessary for your project, but for this one, we're going to go ahead and just do this. Next up, we want to put some styles just on the body. The first one is going to be for the font family. So font family is going to be the Poppins, the one that we imported. And then we have a fallback of sans serif. Next, we'll go ahead and set the font weight to 400. Okay. Now what we can do is go ahead and style the container. This is going to take up the full height of the body, so we'll just do a height of 100%. Then we're going to use Flexbox in order to center the buttons. So we'll do display, flex, And to center things horizontally and vertically, we say align items, center, and justify content, center as well. And now, if we save that, you'll see that these are now centered on our page. Cool. So the next thing we want to style are the buttons. So let's go ahead and style the buttons. So this is the group with all the buttons. And again, we're going to use display flex, so flexbox. And instead of lining them left to right, I want them to be stacked. So a quick way to do this is say flex direction, and then set that to column. Now if we save that, they're stacked on top of each other. All right, so now what we can do is go ahead and style that button class, which is the class that all the buttons have. And this is just going to be some general styling for each of these buttons. The first one is just go ahead and get rid of that text decoration, that underline that comes default with link tags. So text decoration, that's going to be none. So if you save that, you'll see that gets rid of that. We'll go ahead and give this a padding. So this is going to be inside around the font is going to be 20 pixels on the top and bottom, and then 50 pixels on the left and right. Then we'll go ahead and give this a default font size. And I'll go ahead and use rem units here. And if you don't know what rem units are relative units. So, and it's relative to the root element, which in this case is the HTML element. And now by default, this is typically set to 16 pixels. So how you can calculate that is that this is 16 times 1.25. And rem units are really useful if, say, for instance, someone needs the font to be bigger. They can increase the base font size in their browser. Then if you're using rem, everything is going to be scaled up for them, so it's easier for them to see. So now what we need to do is go ahead and set position to relative. And this is going to be useful because we're going to be using absolute positioning a little bit later. And that absolute positioning needs to know what it needs to be relative to. So this is going to be the way that we define this. And last, we're just going to give some of these some margins so they're spaced out a little bit from one another, and that's going to be 32 pixels. If we save that, we can see now that everything's spaced out, and we don't really see buttons yet because we need to style each of those individually. So under this, we can go ahead and create a comment here. We'll do that with a / asterisk button, another asterisk, and then another / Go ahead and say button 1. Then we can go ahead and set our button 1 style, so button -1. We'll go ahead and give this a background. We'll just do pure black to keep things simple. Color here of this pure white. We'll set a border radius, which is going to round the edges of the square or the rectangle. So do 30 pixels. Let's go ahead and save that so you can now get an idea of what that looks like. And then we want to set a transition property, which is going to allow us to have a nice smooth animation when we change certain styles or other properties rather. So what we can do is say transition, and then we can target the style that we're going to be changing. In this case, it's going to be transform. So we'll say transform, how long we want that animation to be, so 0.3 seconds. And then the type of motion we want. So instead of it just being, one solid speed throughout, it's going to ease in and then ease out. Or in this case, just ease. Okay, so now what we can do is we can actually create some pseudo elements in order to get that 3-layered effect. And the first pseudo element we're going to create is going to be after and then also before. So we'll do button -1, 2 dots, and then after, and then button -1 before. And these are just going to essentially be just extra elements behind the button that they're going to move in and out. And you can use pseudo elements for a number of different things, but in this case, we're going to use them in order to get that cool layered effect. So in order to say to create that element, we have to first create some content. And in this case, this content's not going to have anything in it. So we can just leave this as an empty string. Then this is going to use that absolute positioning, so absolute. And then what we want to do is we want to set the opacity on these. So I'm just going to drop these to 0.3. Then we're going to set the background. That's going to be that pure black again. Border radius, we want to just tell it to inherit it from the parent. We'll set a width of 100%. So it's going to take up the full width of the button that we defined above, which is the parent. And then we'll say height 100% as well. Then we can go ahead and give some properties here for the absolute positioning, left being 0 and bottom being 0 as well. Then we want to make sure that these elements are behind this click me main button. So we'll say z index -1. And then again, we want to add some smooth animations on this. So we'll do transform 0.3 seconds, and we'll do an ease as well. All right, so now we can actually start adding our hover effects. So in the first one, we're going to say button-1 hover. What we can do is just transform. We're going to translate. We're going to, the first one is the X value, so -12 pixels to the left, and then -12 pixels, excuse me. And remember on the Y, negative is actually up, so this is going to move to the left and up. So that's everything for the button 1 hover. Now we need to go ahead and animate the other elements. So button 1 hover, this is going to be on the after pseudo class. And what we want to do here is we want to do the same transform. So I'm just going to copy this, paste it here. In this case, we're actually going to move it to the right 6 pixels. And then we're going to move it down 6 pixels. Then I'm just going to copy this style because it's going to be very similar for the before. I'm going to make sure we change this from after to the before pseudo element. And then this time we're going to move it 12 pixels to the right and then 12 pixels down. So now if we save this, we should be able to hover over this, and now we can see that really cool style take effect on button 1. So let's now go ahead and move on to button 2. So again, let's go ahead and add a comment here so we know these are the button 2 styles. We'll scroll down, go ahead and add some styles for button -2. And this is just going to be a color style, and we'll set this to pure black. Now what we want to do is go ahead and create those pseudo elements. So it's going to be button -1, or excuse me, 2. First one's going to do the after element, and we can do button -2, and that's going to then be the before pseudo element. And what we want to do is we want to create a border on these elements. So we'll do border, how thick we want the border, and we want this border to be all the way around. So we'll do 3 pixels. We want the style of the border to be solid, and we'll just go ahead and create a pure black border. Then again, just like for the other elements, we need to set this content to an empty string. Then we'll go ahead and use absolute positioning again. And now we need to set a width and a height. But remember, we added a border here, so we can't just set it to 100 pixels. We actually have to, or 100%, we have to set it to 100% minus 6 pixels for the width, because we have some on the left and 3 pixels on the right. And then we also need to subtract 6 pixels from the top and bottom, because remember, we added 3 pixels to the border all the way around. And a way we can do that is with the calc function. So calc 100% minus 6 pixels. And I'm just going to copy this, paste it here, and I had a typo here. Let's fix that really quick. This is going to be height, and it's the same thing. Now again, we need to set our left to 0, our bottom to 0, our z index to -1, and our transition styles. So transform 0.3 seconds and ease. And we need to add a semicolon here so we're not getting that error. And let's go ahead and save that. And now you can see those elements here. Now right now, if we hover over it, nothing's happening. So now what we can do is go ahead and add those hover styles. So button 2, hover, after, and that's going to be transform, translate. So we'll go ahead and set our translate property. We're going to move it over 5 pixels to the left and then up 5 pixels. Then let's go ahead and just copy this, because the before is essentially just going to be the opposite of this, because that's going to create that cool mirrored effect. So let's go ahead and just get rid of these negatives. And if we save that, we should be done with button 2. There we go. So we get that really cool effect once we hover over it. Now what we can do is move on to my favorite, the button 3. So let's do button 3. And let's go ahead and add our button 3 styles. So button 3 dash 3. Whoops. We'll go ahead and do overflow hidden. And this property is really important in order to get this effect. Now, for now, I'm going to actually select it, hit Command/, and that's going to comment it out. So right now, this effect isn't actually being applied, but you'll see how this is really important later once you see how this effect is going to be achieved. So now let's go ahead and set the color for the font, and that's going to be just a pure white. Let's go ahead and set a border radius of 30 pixels. And then I'm going to add a box shadow. Now right now you're not going to see the box shadow because we're going to set the first 4 values to 0. Now if you've never used box shadow, the first value represents the H offset, so the horizontal offset, so how far off to the left or right. Vertical offset, how far off to the top and bottom the shadows will be. The next one is the blur, the spread, and then you define the color. And we're actually going to be using RGBA in order to define our color here. Now RGB, you might have heard of, red, green, blue, is some numbers that you can add in order to achieve the colors. But with RGBA, you can also define the alpha value, which is the opacity of the color. Now in this case, we're going to do 143, 64, 248, and then we're going to have an opacity of 0.5. Then, in order to create a linear or a gradient, we can do just another color here. So we'll do 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, RGBA. Then we're going to do 39, 200, 255, and an opacity of 0.5. So again, you're not seeing that box shadow because all the first values are set to 0. And now what we can do is go ahead and set a transition property because we're going to be animating transform and box shadow. So we'll do transition. First, we're going to target the transform. It's going to be 0.3 seconds ease. Then box shadow, 0.3 seconds ease. Whoops. Okay. So now that we have our button 3 style done, you'll see that nothing's actually here, or you at least can't see anything, because right now all this really is a transparent button with this color set to white, which is hidden on a white background. But with these pseudo elements, you'll see here what we're going to achieve. So button -3, we'll go ahead and target the after pseudo element. Again, we need to set content to something, in this case, just an empty string. We'll set the width to 400 pixels. And we'll set a height to 400 pixels. Again, we're going to use position absolute. We'll scroll down a little bit. And then we're just going to offset this a little bit. So the top, I'm going to offset 50 pixels to the left. And the left, I'm going to, or excuse me, 50 pixels from the top, and then the left, 100 pixels. And then we're going to have a background color, and this is going to act essentially as a fallback, or for older browsers that don't support gradients, we can just go ahead and define a hex code here. So it's going to be this cool pink color. Now what we can do is go ahead and define a linear gradient. We can do that on this property called background image. Then we have a function called linear gradient that first takes an argument of the direction of the gradient. So we can set that to 225 degrees. So that's like the angle of the gradient. And then we can define the colors on the gradient and then their position. So the first one is going to be a hex code here of 27D86C. And then we need to tell it of the position. Now, the first spot in the gradient is at position 0. So we'll do 0%. Then we can go ahead and find another color here. This one's going to be at the halfway point, so we'll do 50%. And then we'll do our last color. And this is going to be at the very end or at 100%. So if we save that, you now see this huge square. It kind of seems a little weird, right? And this is where that overflow comes in handy. But before we do that, let's go ahead and add our last styles here, which are going to be z-index. Whoops. And again, we want this to be behind. So you'll see once we change this to -1 and save it, we can see that click me come through, which is what we set on the parent element. And then we can set transition, transform 0.5. So we're going to do this a little slower and ease, or not slower, but longer. All right, so let's go ahead and save that. And now let's go ahead and scroll up, uncomment out this overflow. You'll see now anything that was outside of what we defined here on button 3 is now hidden because we have overflow set to hidden. All right, so now what we can do is just add a couple more hover styles here in order to get that really cool gradient effect. So on button 3, hover, what we want to do is we want to change the transform first. We're going to do translate. On the x-axis, I'm not going to move it at all, but on the y-axis, I'm actually going to move it up just a little bit, and I'm just going to do 6 pixels. Then I'm going to do the box shadow, and I'm actually going to come up here and just copy this so I don't have to write it again. And what we want to do is we want to change these values on the offsets and the blur and the spread. So we'll do 10 pixels, -10 pixels, 25, and then we'll keep the other one at 0. So 25 pixels. And I'm just going to copy this because they're going to be pretty similar to these over here. Paste them in. This one's going to be -10. This one's going to be positive, and then we'll keep that at 25. So let's go ahead and save that. If we see that, you can see now how we can start to see that gradient once we hover over it, and it looks pretty cool. Now what we can do is animate that, that square that's in the middle. So what we can do is on the button 3, hover, targeting the after pseudo element. Then we can just rotate it with transform, rotate, and then we can rotate it by whatever degree amount we want. In this case, we're going to do 150 degrees. So let's go ahead and save that. Now, if we click over it, you can see that really cool effect. And just to show you what's happening here, let's go ahead and just comment out this overflow, save it. You can see all that's happening is that square is rotating. So let's make sure we go ahead and uncomment that and save it. And there we go. Now we have these really cool 3 modern CSS hover effects. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing, and be sure to check out our other design and development tutorials on our YouTube channel and on skillthrive.com. Again, I'm Hunter from Skillthrive, and I'll see you in the next one.